Anybody want to say whether or not that they feel that's true? Oh, never mind. Forget
We
it.
are live. Thanks for bearing with us as we have technical difficulties. We're getting some life lessons from Tom Curran today, but and more on the way. And so welcome to the third edition of the Misco Hill Middle School Inspired Innovation Center, Inspiring Careers. We are pleased to be joined by NBC Boston Patriots insider, Tom Curran. Tom, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Mr. Quinn. Thank you to everybody for showing up. This will be fun.
Yeah, so we've got an audience on YouTube. We've got a great group of participants in the room today who will be asking some questions. I've known Mr. Curran for a long time, although I wouldn't say we're close because it was just a one-time event. But when I was a 17-year-old working for the Attleboro Sun Chronicle in obviously Attleboro, I got a press pass to cover a Patriots press conference. And while I'd written, lots of columns and enjoyed writing, that was the first kind of big event that I went to. And needless to say, I was rather intimidated. So at those events, you go in and you hear from Bill Belichick, who's kind of giving the week overview, and Mark Farinella, who I tagged along with, gave me one piece of advice: then don't ask Bill a question. Because it probably would not end up well. But got a chance to, go into the locker room, and I was kind of wandering around and, trying to work up the courage to ask some questions. And then Mr. Curran was kind enough to come up to me and notice that I was struggling a bit, and told me who was going to be friendly. Go talk to Christian Ferrier, talk to Dan Klecko, stay away from a couple of the other players who just weren't in the mood. And it went from being, kind of a wandering experience to a really powerful, confidence building piece for me that served as a springboard, working at UMass with guys like Mark Bertrand and Jeff Howe and Dan Duggan. We were all at the Daily Collegian together, and then all the way to the 18th green of the US Open. So Tom, I don't know if I can greatly express just the impact that you've had just on my life, but Tom, once a teacher, always a teacher.
It's amazing to hear that, because it's so appreciated, because, there's these little things, and guys, you're going to see this throughout your lives. There's probably a number of you out there who can think of little things that people did for you that made a real big difference. And I didn't know I was making a big difference. I just I like introducing people to things if they seem ill at ease. And I did that for Mr. Quinn, and you guys keep that in mind, because you're going to see people today who might need hey, how's it going? Or you need a hand with that, and it's going to happen throughout your lives. And if you can do that, you might not even know it. And then what the hell, 15, 17 years down the road, your Mr. Quinn might call up and say, that really made a huge impact on my life. And you'll say, really? And you might not be having a great time in your life when you hear that. I mean, I'm going through some stuff. Everything's fine. Family's, fine. But, life gets on you. When you hear something like that, it makes you feel good. So is that a pay it forward situation, Mr. Quinn?
I think it is.
Pay it forward, guys. Be nice when you can.
Yeah, and you never know what kind of impact you're having. So let's dive into the career piece of it. So, Tom, how'd you get started with sports journalism? Did it start in college? Did it start in high school? How'd you get your start, and how did it progress?
I loved playing sports. I was okay at them, but I realized by the time I was in junior high, heading into high school, look, I'm not going to be a professional athlete, much less a college athlete. I'm barely a high school athlete here, folks. But I knew I could read, and I knew I could write. And I knew that from the time I was in first, second, or third grade. I loved to read. And I knew by the time I was in fourth, fifth, sixth grade that I was able to get the thoughts from my brain into my imagination and out into a pencil, which is what we had to use. So when I realized I wasn't going to play, I realized also that the next best thing was to do what everyone was doing that I spent all my time reading. I read the Patriot Ledger. I read the newspapers. You guys, I'm sure, read online now or on your phones. You might watch videos, but you probably also read some stories. The more I became acclimated to reading, digesting, understanding the different ways to write and express yourself, the more I said, I can definitely do that. So in high school, I was good in English and I wrote well. And I had a reporter for a day honor with the Patriot Ledger where I covered a game and my story got in the paper, but I really didn't do anything with it. I went to college. I was an English major. I was a young kid, 17 when I graduated high school. It was different then. People graduated much more young. So I wasn't a real mature guy and I didn't have a great plan. And I didn't do much when I was in college towards writing. It's just my English major stuff. And when I got out, I thought I might want to get into public relations or something like that, which is also writing and expressing yourself. And I thought sports public relations. That wasn't working. I went into sales. And then that didn't work out. And all of a sudden, guys, you know those people who take care of your lawns? They drive up in the big trucks with the tanks on them and they come in the uniform and they spray your lawns. That's what I was doing for about 2 years after I graduated college, took a sales job, and then did this. And at that time I said, well, you love sports, you're a good writer. You better figure out a way to at least pursue it as a career. And I did that. And after a lot of work over 2 years trying to find a niche, I got a small, tiny little weekly newspaper that would hire me. And I actually had to deliver my own papers for the first 2 years, from 1992 to 1994 when I was young. 24, 25, 26 years old. And then I went to a bigger paper and I was the editor. I had to take my own pictures too. And I was covering guys like you. I'd cover your middle school teams. That was what I started out doing. I'd cover your middle school team, your basketball team, talk to your coach, find out how you were doing, write the little things that we do. And I try to get better at the craft because it is a craft. It's certainly a skill that people are born with, but you can get better at it, at expressing yourself. And that's another thing Mr. Quinn would probably say to you. You have to be open to criticism. I was not. I was very closed-minded. I don't want you touching my stuff. I don't know. Because I felt as if it was an attack on me because I created it. At some point, you're going to have to give up your babies, as they say. But anyway, so I did that and I worked at a small paper and then a bigger paper and then a bigger paper. And in 1997, I started writing for the Metro West Daily News, which is close by you guys, I think. Mm-hmm. So I wrote for them for 5 years, and that's the first opportunity I had to cover the Patriots, which meant I'd cover high school games and take phone calls from baseball coaches and write it up. And then once a week on Wednesdays, I would go down to the Patriots and I would talk to as many people as I could and load up my notebook with as many different story ideas as I could jam in. And then I'd write the stories all week for the rest of the week. And then I'd cover the games on Sunday, and it was tremendous. I eventually got to a bigger paper, the Providence Journal, which is kind of what the goal was for me, because there were newspapers then, guys. We're going to talk about this, but there were newspapers then. So my goal was to get to a newspaper. I got to a newspaper, a big one. I said, this is great. This is what I wanted. I've infiltrated the entire process because it was really hard to get a job, and I was happy as heck. And I did really well there. But then in 2006, as the internet was starting, folks at NBC, the network, were just going to get Sunday Night Football. And they didn't even have a website. So they reached out to me. There was one person named Joe Jeshu who got my name from Peter King, who's a famous writer. Wow. And Peter King knew my name because I was in the right place at the right time covering the Patriots. So Peter King would read my stuff on the Patriots in the Providence Journal. So Peter recommended me to Joe Jeshu. Joe Jeshu called me and said, would you like to write for the internet? We understand that you're kind of one of those people who can do that. And I said, absolutely. So suddenly now I'm covering the whole league. And I did that for about 3 years. And then NBC Sports Boston was starting to build out their network. And they said, we're going to be like a mini ESPN in Boston. We're going to cover everything. We're going to do news shows. We're going to do regular shows. And they said, do you want to join us? And I said, you know what? I'm better at covering the Patriots than I am covering the 32 other teams. I'll happily do that. So I was able to come back, and I've been at NBC Sports Boston since 2009, November of 2009. And I'm lucky. I'm really lucky, guys. And there's a big component of being in the right place at the right time. Let me say this more slowly. So much of life we chalk up to luck. I was in the right place at the right time. But to be in the right place means you have to leave your house, put down your phone, and interact with others. You have to go and get it. Maybe you don't feel like doing that right now. You might not feel like doing it when you're 18 or 19, like I didn't. So I went and had a good time in college and didn't do it. It took me standing in a green uniform, spraying lawns with an English degree for me to say, it's time for me to go get it if I'm going to get it at all. And I was fortunate, but I got out there. You got to get out there. All right. That's the end of my personal story.
Well, and I think, Tom, there's a lot there too, because, and this came up in one of other interviews, just because you start off in one job doesn't mean that you can't, pivot and make moves to go do something that you may be better suited at. Right. And I think having that courage to get out there, to identify what you are passionate about, and then having that courage to take the leap. Jim Carrey had a really awesome graduation speech about how his dad could have been a great comedian, but he went with a safe job as an accountant, and for 12 years it worked, and then that job was no longer safe. And sometimes but he, on the other hand, took that leap to become a comedian, and now can impact lives that way. So having that courage to get out there is just so critical. And then the importance of everything you're doing, even if it's a small paper, built upon each other. Peter King was reading your work at one of the smaller publications, but that all led to a huge opportunity with NBC. And so just making the most of no matter what level you're at, just trying to, like you said, perfect the craft is just so critical. So let's talk a little bit about what's a day in the life like for Tom Curran now, in your current role as the Patriots insider. What's, like the schedule like? And then can you also touch upon like what are the really awesome parts of your job, but also, hey, what are some things that people may not see behind, when the cameras are off?
Sure. Every day, as you guys know, and this is the great thing about covering sports, it's different. It's a different story. It's a different, because we're covering things that are actually happening. That's why sports is so fun, as opposed to covering, for instance, politics. There's an authenticity, guys, to sports that doesn't necessarily exist in politics or many things. So if you're enlivened, if you enjoy authenticity, sports is great because something always happens. There's always a game to assess whether or not something actually happened. So part of my day is dictated by what happened. That's why my day is never as predictable as you might think. For instance, yesterday or over the weekend, Sunday, supposed to be a quiet day for me. There's no games on Sunday. I was going to lie low, but I got a message from someone that a player that had been traded, named Matt Stafford. He was traded to the Los Angeles Rams from the Detroit Lions. He was heading there. This person told me they were involved in the negotiations for their own team. They said, hey, Matt Stafford didn't want to go to the New England Patriots. And I was, whoa, really? And did a little checking. That checked out. So I wrote that story on Sunday, not expecting to be working. And when I wrote it and sent it, I said, this is going to be a big deal. So that story dictated my Monday. What did it mean that a guy who was a pretty good player was taking the Patriots off their list? Why did he say that? Is that really, really bad? Kind of bad? Not that bad at all? Well, we'll have an email in the morning that comes because I do television at night at a 6 o'clock show called Early Edition. And the email comes out that'll say, Patriots, here's a topic, here's a topic, here's a topic, here's a topic. These are ideas that we start with. And people give their opinions. Then we all start to rehash the opinions back and forth, trying to decide which angles we want to take to talk about these things. It's an hour-long show, so it's busy. While that's going on and we're preparing for the show, I'm also trying to set up guests for my podcast, which I do on Tuesdays. Is this okay, David, the way I'm explaining it?
Yeah, no, I think there's some follow-up questions too, but yeah. And so, keep going.
Okay. So I'm trying to get my guests for my Tuesday show, and knowing that it's the Super Bowl, I'm hoping there's good guests who I can ask questions to that move stories forward, because there's a million stories around every team, but the Patriots have, Bill Belichick, and how's he going to get the team back where it was, and Cam Newton, and will he be back, and what are they going to do with the quarterback position, and what about Tom Brady? Why is he doing so well with Tampa Bay if the Patriots moved on from them. Explain these things. So you want to find guests who help explain it and people who are entertaining that you guys want to listen to. So I'm playing on my podcast. Additionally, there is in entertainment on your phones, guys. And I have a little phone. Don't make fun of it. Oh, it's my wife. In order for this whole thing to work, we have to provide you guys content. So when there isn't a big story like Matt Stafford to talk about, not wanting to come to the Patriots, we better come up with something. So sometimes it's like milking a cow, and the cow's like, I don't want to be milked. Well, we got to get some milk out of this cow. So the milk on some days is going to be, give me a summary of the Patriots wide receiver position and how they look right now and what they have to do in the offseason. Might be just little, but I can say, okay, here's that. It's crackers. It's not a full meal. Have these crackers. And then you feel like, all right, at least I did something today. So you'll do that stuff during the day. And then at some point the shows come and you go and you do the shows. You have a quick meeting before. But when we get on the shows, we don't tell each other what we're going to say. And we don't really script how we're going to, like some people are like, oh, that's all scripted. They take different sides. Not really. It's very personality driven. Sometimes I tell people before I said, I'm going to argue with everything that comes out of your mouth just for fun. I used to do that to a woman named Casey Smith, who I did a show with. But usually it's very organic and there's a lot of chemistry involved. So it's a fun job in that way because it's always different.
To your point, Tom, there's this nice balance between prep work. You just don't show up on to go on air and, wing it, right? So that there's some prep work in the show in terms of, structuring or at least having an outline. Because there are people that you work with, even if you don't go into, sports journalism. I've worked in TV trucks. They've got to prep all the graphics. They've got to get all the video, the B-roll to be, playing while you're talking. So there's a lot of work that goes into it beforehand. But also there seems to be a lot of networking that you need to do to create this content, right? This is a lot of relationship driven business. And if you don't have, that network to draw upon during, the slow times, it seems like it'd be really tough.
You're exactly right. And you have to be imaginative. And sometimes, as you guys know, why do they put you guys in these group projects sometimes? And some people end up doing all the work, some don't, whatever. They put you in group projects because there's a word called collaboration. It's like cooperation, but collaboration means we all put our brains together and we produce something as a group. And that collaboration, sometimes I'm very, very guilty of this, guys. I think my ideas are the best. Part of that's because I grew up that way. I grew up in the business doing it on my own, kind of on those little papers that I did. And then at the Providence Journal, there was nobody with me. And then at NBC, there was nobody with me. And I just, what do you got? I'm doing this. When I got to TV, I had a lot of people I had to answer to. What do you want to talk about? I don't know. Well, let's talk about this. That's stupid. I didn't say it directly that often, but sometimes it got close. And that's no fun to work with someone like that. So that's something I'm always working on, guys, is my interpersonal skills, collaboration skills.
So we've talked, Tom, about, writing. We've talked about the, website platforms, the TV platforms. I'm going to toss it over to our athletic director, Chris Schmidt. He had a question about social media in your role. Chris, sure. Go ahead.
Well, thanks, Dave. You know what I just realized, Tom, too? You and Bert Breer were at Metro West at the same time. Talk about a heavy hitter for a small paper at that point.
Mike Reese, too.
And I didn't know Mike was there. Wow.
And John Tomasi.
That's impressive. One of you probably covered me when I was coaching. But,
where?
Franklin.
What year?
I started in 2001.
I would have had your final year if I got over to Franklin, but I didn't go over there because the track coach hated me.
Which one, Travato?
Yeah.
They hate a lot of people, but
sorry, guys.
My question, actually, we live in a world now where information is virtually instantaneous, and everyone wants to be the person to break the story. You talk about Matt Stafford and the Pats, him not being on the Pats. or the Pats not being on his wish list, excuse me. What do you, I guess, as a journalist, how do you balance wanting to be that person that breaks the story, but at the same time, I guess, being patient to make sure you get the story correct?
It's a great question, Chris, Mr. Schmidt. And guys, it's something that's going to be constantly changing. So the answer I give you now might not be true when you are going to college yourselves or in professional situations. Before the gestation period, that means how long it takes something to grow, it was longer. When I was in newspapers, you had 24 hours. Well, you don't have 24 hours anymore. So before, I'd call one guy, he'd tell me something, and I didn't have to worry about the website. I didn't have to worry about social media and immediacy. I could say, I better check this out with somebody else, find out, maybe get two sources and write a long story that's very involved and covers all the bases. Well, now it's changed so that if I get something that nobody else has, I think I better make sure it's right, but also make sure I get it out quick because somebody else might be on the trail. So what ends up happening, Mr. Schmidt, is, and this is very important for you guys, as you've paid attention to, you've heard and I'm not being political here, but you hear allegations of fake news. What's fake news? What does that mean? Well, it's what is well sourced from sources that you trust. If this guy says it, do you think that he did all the checking on it? Is he pretty well connected? Would he know what he's talking about? You have to be a critical reader. And when you guys are doing this, you want to build up a reputation as a critical and trustworthy reporter of things. Your friends want to be able to trust stuff you say at the cafeteria table, back when you used to have cafeteria tables. So that to me is what's interesting to balance, Chris, Mr. Schmidt, is I got to get it out fast. And I might have to use qualifiers that go from I'm hearing to my understanding is to a source tells me. All those different things are interesting little qualifiers that unfortunately we need to use. And then sometimes you just say it is. Ideally, you want to say Bill Belichick told me or Tom Brady told me. But sometimes, especially now in so much media, things can be so explosive, even if you don't want them to be. Guys, like, can you just say a source? So we end up doing that, which is not that great all the time, but it is what it is.
Is
So
there
to follow up, go
is there
ahead.
a particular story that you're most proud of?
I think my reporting on Tom Brady's situation over the last 3 years is something I feel proud of, in that as much as folks didn't want to hear about the way it seemed as if this great and important person and player was moving on from this great and important team, from a brilliant person in Bill Belichick, it was important to stay on that. And I think that I was more accurate on that than really anyone. And I also tried to be respectful as much as I could of Tom's feelings, the fans' feelings, Bill Belichick's reasons for doing things that he did. So I think that the Christopher at this late stage, I'm really proud of how I covered what is an historic development.
As a follow-up to that question, I'm curious about what do you do in a situation where a source is wrong? Does that kind of hamper the relationship? Do they follow up and call and say, I'm sorry? I guess case in point, you're talking about the Matt Stafford trade. There was a report earlier that he was headed to the 49ers, I think earlier in the weekend, which would have had potentially big implications for the Patriots. What happens in that context when you particularly when you've gone out on a limb and reported it and that source was wrong?
You better just say, got it wrong. Like in 2008, Tom Brady injured his knee badly. I had an ACL, MCL, and all this stuff. And I had somebody who would be as close to it as possible tell me it's kind of a mess. He's got an infection in there. The infection might create problems for the healing, and it could impair his 2009 season. Well, I wrote I wrote about it, reported it, and it was a very big story. You're talking about Tom Brady might miss 2009 as well. Well, very quickly, folks, and I didn't do enough checking. I knew what they would tell me. That's not the way it is. But the person who was telling me would know.
Mhm.
So I didn't really give them an opportunity to push back, whether it was Tom or his agents or folks near him. And when they inevitably did push back and say, no, that's not how it is. It was hard. And I took a lot of heat because it's health. It can change. The interesting thing was Tom Brady didn't miss any time and he played, but all the situations were as dire as they were. So I had to say, look, if this is a health issue, it's changeable. It might be different. He might look different, but Tom eventually said a few years ago, look, they were telling me I might not play again in 2009. So people still bring that up to me. Oh, aren't you the guy who said Tom Brady was going to be done after 2008? It is what it is. As long as you're going with somebody who's close to it, you can say, look, that's what I got. If you've put yourself out on a limb based on somebody's aunt's cousin who has a mailman, then you could be in real trouble.
Tom, we're coming up on the end of our time together.
I'm
I got a couple
sorry.
more questions. No, it's I got a couple more questions. I didn't know if any of our student panelists want to jump in with a question before I do.
I hope I wasn't too long-winded, but anybody, please, I'm happy to answer your questions, guys. Coop, nothing? Chloe? Hey,
I
Ben,
have a question.
what do you got?
What sort of degrees did you earn in college to be able to do your job?
Great question. I was just an English major. That's it. I was a Bachelor of Arts in English. And the cool thing about sports writing is, or many jobs, if you're pretty good at it and industrious, meaning you do a lot of work, it'll shine through. Not saying that it's not great to get degrees, but you guys know that stuff's expensive. Real solid experience is as important or more important than the degrees, although sometimes you need that degree to even be able to be considered.
So, and this is something we talked about beforehand, but we think about degrees, but can you talk a little bit about how you're seeing the landscape shift within sports journalism? And then, how can our students now kind of catching the wave on current trends?
Mhm.
Because how the landscape looks now might not be how it's going to be by the time they're graduating from college and heading into the workforce themselves.
In one way, there is much, much, much less opportunity. In another way, it's exponentially more. Like you guys can cover video games. You guys can cover so many different things, that are consumed. So you can create sports content that is sports media content in genres that didn't exist. Skateboarding, freestyle skiing, you name it. And there are places that you can find to put that. However, because newspapers have kind of gone away, you've got a lot of jobs that people could do from the age of 23 to 65 years old that don't exist anymore. What ends up happening is people want to get into this business and be a sports writer and be in the locker rooms and talk to the players. But because the dynamic is constantly changing because of these things and because of the computers, I don't know if it's going to be the same way in 10 years. I don't know if there's going to be any locker room access. Do players even need to have us in their locker room when they can Zoom with us in a public setting? We've learned that because of the pandemic. It might be just as effective. Why do they want us in there breathing a bunch of germs on them in the locker room, even after this pandemic ends? Same thing with why do they want media at all? Can't they just funnel it out through their own teams or through their own websites? I think there's always going to be a role for it because we have to understand, okay, who can filter what's real and what isn't. But you guys are entering very much a wild, wild west sports media landscape. And you're going to have to be very imaginative. Great opportunity for all of you, but it's going to demand some imagination too.
Chloe had a question. Chloe, go ahead.
Okay. What was your sort of motivation to keep doing what you do?
Oh, it's a great question, my friend. I love it. I loved it, and I was good at it. That's why. I mean, I wasn't making a lot of money, my friend. I set a goal for myself that I had to get to a big paper, a city paper by the time I was 35, or I was going to quit. And I did it at 35. And otherwise I was going to quit. I was going to go and one of the jobs that I had was something called field turf. I was going to start selling field turf. I don't think that would have been my lifelong goal, but I would have done really well at it. But I had kids. I had a wife. We were trying to get ahead. But I had the passion to do this particular job, Chloe. But I cried, I cried when I didn't get jobs. I was not fun to be around with my kids who were young sometimes because I was frustrated and desperate and urgent. But there's a cost, I guess, to following your heart. And there's other people who are going to come with you that you have to kind of look at them and go, you guys still okay with me doing this? So you'll be great. All you'll be great.
Yeah, I'm sure it's got to be, there's time away from your families. You're working on holidays. Like that's kind of the downside. I remember, just working the USGA, and even just with the Paw Sox when I was in college, it's like, when everybody else is having their barbecue, you're out, you're on the job, and then you're on deadline to make sure, you get the report in, right?
Those great parties that everyone had at what was called the Snow Bowl, and everyone's like, yeah, we were at this place and we were all having a great time. I was driving in the snow to get to that game. I was lucky enough to watch it in person and talk to people afterwards. But there were times when I'd be at games and I'm like, my friends are all watching this game someplace and having a blast. Here I am. Oh, Ben's got a hand up.
Ben, go ahead.
I was wondering how many articles on average do you write about every month? How many articles do you write?
Good question. I would say probably 5 to 8 a week. And the articles that I write are usually a little longer. They're like 700 to 1,000 words. I need to start writing shorter because people's attention spans are shorter. But I write columns and analysis sometimes, and it takes a lot for me to explain it. But I have to get better, Ben, at being more concise. And I'm still working to do that. Some people write 4 or 5 a day, which equates to 25 a week. I'm still probably in that. Did I say 5 to 8? Now I'm probably about 10 to 12. So about 40 a month.
Wow. On top of your podcast, your show
And the TV, yeah.
Yep. Nathan's next. Nathan, you have a question.
What was your favorite game to write an article about for the Patriots?
Probably the Super Bowl win in 2014 over the Seahawks was probably my favorite one. But I've probably written better stories than that one. One of my favorite stories was writing a story after the Patriots beat the Pittsburgh Steelers in 2018, I think. And it was because I went into the locker room and I saw Tom Brady on the phone after a great comeback, and he was FaceTiming with his kids. And it just was so different than all the other players. You have a guy who just won this incredible game, who did all these things, and everyone has an image of him. And I could hear him talking to his kids about their game that they played that day, probably his oldest, his son named Jack. And it struck me, and I used that in the story just to illustrate it. So I thought that was, and I got a few different ones that are fun, but the point that I'm trying to make on that, Ben, is you better have your eyes open. You got to be looking. You got to be observing and saying, how does that thing that I just saw tie into this?
Jonathan, you've got a question.
What did you write about when there was coronavirus and there was nothing really to write about?
Very good question. There were no sports games to write about, but there were a million things to write about in terms of how will the league deal with this? What will the impact of these players not being able to practice be? How is the best way the league should proceed? So that, again, is the great thing about journalism. Any question that you would have, Jonathan, about how coronavirus was it affecting, like, what is Tom Brady doing during, if he was still a Patriot, what is he doing during this pandemic? How does he operate? All of those are stories. And that's why it's great to have those, like I said, eyes wide open and imagination.
Chloe, you got one more?
Yeah. What was sort of your biggest challenge during like your whole process of your job?
S- starting to write is hard. It's really hard. And sitting in front of a computer and staring at it is hard. That's hard for me, Chloe. Sometimes it weighs in my stomach and just feels like my stomach's compressing on itself. Got to do it, got to do it, got to do it. And you don't want to do it. But then when you start doing it, you're like, oh, I'm good at this. Here it comes. It's coming. It's coming. It's okay. There it goes. It's done. Okay, great. And you just feel so good when you finish doing it, because you're like, this is what I'm supposed to do. And I just did a good job doing it. And now people are going to read it and they're either going to love it or hate it, but they're going to have an opinion. So that's why it's a fun job to do.
Ben, I'm going to give you the last question before we wrap it up.
Okay. Other than Tom Brady, what sports player do you think you've written the most about?
That's great. And we'll take Bill out of it too then. Boy, I would say probably Gronk. Maybe. Yeah, probably Gronk. Or Ty Law, because I've known Ty Law for so long. And I had such a good friendship with him that I've probably written about him the longest. So those two, Gronk and Ty Law.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks to the panel. One thing, even though the landscape is changing, Tom, I'm sure there's always going to be room for excellent analysis, right? Like that's going to be the one
Yep.
job that everybody's going to be looking for. And to that end, so moving from this great conversation, thank you again, Tom, for your time with us, but to moving towards action, I want to share this challenge that we've got coming up for MURSD students who are watching live, but also we'll be sharing it out. We're going to do the MURSD hot takes, so the hot take challenge. So if you're passionate about sports and you've got an insightful opinion, it could be about the upcoming Super Bowl, Tom Brady versus Bill Belichick, whether or not the UConn women's hoops team is going to, get back to the Final Four and then take the national championship. We want to hear from you. So your challenge is to prepare and record a 60 to 90-second video or audio recording, sharing your opinion and your reasons behind it. If you've ever watched Tom on NBC Sports Boston, he delivers it with a lot of confidence and conviction, but he is never over the top so that people miss his message. So our challenge going from thinking about a career in sports to actually diving in is you're going to do your 60 to 90 second hot take. Tom, is this representing something you have to do on a regular basis?
Yes, absolutely. When we do video content, they sometimes say, hey, you don't have to write a story here. Why don't you just talk about this thing for 60 to 90 seconds? And we're going to lay some video over it and do some cartoons, just really good, dynamic, exciting stuff to lay under it. So it's great. So you guys have a blast with it, and it'll be you're in charge. Again, that's a great thing about this industry is you can be in charge because it's your idea.
So, all right. So, Tom, one last question before we let you go. How big of a surprise will it be who's under center for the Patriots come next September?
It'll be a huge surprise because we have no idea who it's going to be at all. I mean, you can put money on so many different horses, and you could put money on 15 different horses, and somebody who's not even, I don't know, I'm not a horse race guy, is not even in the stable ends up winning.
Yeah. So we'll stay tuned, and we know that you'll have the outstanding coverage for us. So for the Mendon Upton Regional School District, the Misco Hill Inspired Innovation Center, I'm Dave Quinn. Thanks again to our sponsor, American Student Assistance, who makes this grant possible. Thank you again to Tom Curran for sharing his time and his insights. And thank you to our panelists for their excellent questions and their participation